Yes.
Okay. So, at the end last time, we were considering what's called the semantic mismatch objection to Andreassen's proposal to treat Cavalli-Sforza's terminal groups on his classification system as the races. And there are these two objections. One is this doesn't really fit very well with how we ordinarily think about these things. So it can't really count as an interpretation of how we ordinarily think, because these groups are so unlike the groups that we normally would propose to be races. And so, for example, Pacific Islands, Southeast Asians, and the parent population of these two would be one such group, and nobody's ever proposed that those should be thought of as a race. And second, these groups are not, they're distinguishable statistically, but they're not distinguishable in the way that we normally think of races as being distinguishable, namely by looking at people. They don't, these groups are quite diverse in their appearance, and some of them in some of the groups are quite like people, quite like people in some of the other groups. So there's not a way that all these people look. There's lots of different ways they look. And also, some of them look like people who are classified by this system in other groups. So, for example, Aboriginal Australians have hair and skin that's very like tropical Africans. Black skin and curly hair. But they're, from the point of view of this analysis, they definitely don't belong in the same group. They belong in two entirely distinct groups. All right. Now, but to force this objection, to make this objection, you have to do the second thing that he said you had to do, which is what he called linguistics. This is the complaint that comes from a view about language. And you have to decide whether, in fact, this is an empirical question about how people use the English language. English speakers typically believe that everybody of a certain race has to be identifiable by looking at them, and that this combined set of Pacific Islanders, the Southeast Asians, and the parent population of these two that wouldn't count as a race for most people. They would say, whatever we mean by race, that doesn't count. But of course, that would be an empirical inquiry, because hardly anybody has ever thought about that question, since most people haven't read Cavalli-Sforza. Most people don't know about his classification. And so we could send that picture around, that slide around, and see what people thought about it, but we don't actually know. And my guess is that many people might not object to Cavalli-Sforza. They say, well, he's an expert on this. He says this is how you should classify people. It's got one thing right. Africans are a separate race from the rest of us. So they might say, no, that's okay. We don't mind. I don't know what they would say. But also, this is, Spencer is running this objection, right? Now let me say, look, there's a worry about this claim, right? Which is that many people apparently think that Jews are a race, that Jewish people are a race, right? Or at least they think it's not a crazy. They don't think that if you say Jews are a race, you're making a mistake about English. You may be making a mistake about Jews or about races, but you're not making a mistake about English, right? And many of those people don't think that you can tell whether someone's Jewish by looking, right? Which is correct, of course, you can't. There's a nice study done by Hans Eysenck, who was a British psychologist, I think in the 60s, it was a kind of naughty study. He took a bunch of anti-Semites, put them in a room with a bunch of Jews, and asked them to tell him, and asked them to tell him which were the Jews, and they got it right at chance level. I'm Jews and Gentiles. So even anti-Semites aren't very good at telling Jews from non-Jews. So they may think they can, of course, but in fact they're not very good at it. They're a better way of telling whether someone is a Jew in a room which is 50-50 Jews and Gentiles is to toss a coin, or at least an equally good way. All right. Now, but there's an obvious way to come back from all this, right? For Andreasen, which is to say, you're telling me that this doesn't match with the ordinary way people, I wasn't doing that. I'm a philosopher of biology. I was interested in how race works as a biological concept, so I don't care about mismatches. So that this isn't a proposal about ordinary English. It's a proposal about how to understand biological talk about race. However, if she makes that move, now think back to our ideas about semantic deference. If you make that move, then if ordinary speakers mean to be deferring to biologists when they use the word race, then the combination of this being true and that being true is that ordinary speakers mean to be referring to whatever the biologists mean to be referring to. And so if that's what the biologists are referring to, that's what ordinary people are referring to, whether they know it or not. Right? Now, you and I are allowed to talk about electrons, though only some of you know enough physics to be able to do even the most elementary job of explaining what an electron is or how you would find one. Most of you, because you're well-educated people who would let you in here if you want, think that electrons have negative charge. But I think you could use the word electron without knowing that. That means that some people can use the word electron and be referring to something that has a negative charge and not know that they're referring to something that has a negative charge. So the fact that somebody would say, I don't know whether electrons have a negative charge, doesn't mean that they can't talk about electrons. It doesn't mean that it isn't true that the way they use the word electron, it refers to something with a negative charge. So now also this this is another puzzle about this position. The hypothesis isn't a biological proposal, it's a philosopher's proposal, a semantic proposal. And so that means that if you reject Andreasen's proposal and you're a biologist, you're making a mistake about what the word means. Well, that seems weird. I mean, you can't, on the one hand, we're deferring to the biologists about what it refers to, but when they make a claim about it, we're saying, sorry, you don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't mean that. Anyway, so there are a bunch of puzzles about that semantic mismatch objection, which I will now leave alone. Now, I'm not going to, I had planned originally to have a discussion here, but I'm so far behind that I think what I'll do instead is ask you whether you have any questions about what I've said in the last couple of lectures about it. I'm going to go and say a bit more about the biology, but is there any puzzles left for you by what I've said? The main thing I want to persuade you of is that, yes, go ahead.
Can I just ask her?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so when you say that this challenge is the challenge for hypothesis is saying that because because ordinary people speak about race in a different way for biologists. And basically saying very people are higher, like ordinary speech defines something over assignment.
Well, non-ordinary speech is presupposing that how you tell what a word really refers to is by asking the sound.
Right.
So this thought comes from a discussion a long time ago in the 60s and 70s by well, very long time ago. It was my life, but a very long time ago by Hilary Putnam, lots of language, lots of many other ones, who was interested in the question. It's in a paper called Meanings Ain't in the Head. And he was interested in the fact that you and I, are you a botanist? No, nor am I. Perfect. So you and I will sometimes say of something, oh, that's an elm. Right? Maybe because somebody says to you, that's an elm. You say, okay, I see, that's an elm. And then you might sometimes say of something, that's a beech. Okay. But neither you nor I has any idea how to tell the difference between an elm or a beech. Right? So we're allowed to use the word, but we understand that the way we use the word relies on expert botanists to determine whether something is an elm or a beech or not. We can't, you and I can't do that by ourselves. And we can learn them. We can use the words elm and beech without having capacity to distinguish. So what are we doing there? Well, Henry Putnam said this is what he called linguistic division of labor. I'm deferring to the botanists when I use the word elm, in the sense that if they tell me that I pointed something and I say it's an elm, they tell me it isn't, I'm gonna say, okay, it isn't. I'm not gonna say, I'm command of the English language. I'm allowed to call anything I like an elm. Maybe the way the English language works is you're allowed to call something an elm, you think it's an elm, unless the expert tell you it isn't. Right? So then, part of semantics is knowing things like that. Part of what a linguist ought to know about the word elm is that the way it's used in English, you do not have to be able to distinguish elms from beeches or oaks or chestnuts or other trees. This is just an instance of the same. Gotcha. Okay. Good. Thanks for asking. All right. All right. Now Spencer considers a second kind of objection to Andreasen, which he calls the treeness objection. It's a version of the complaint that I've already made. In building these models, Cavalli-Sforza assumes that it's true, at least roughly, that at the time at which reproductive isolation occurs, once it has occurred, each population was reproductively isolated at some time, and it was reproductively isolated at all times from then to when it evolved. And so this is the thought that in that Cavalli-Sforza picture, the ancestors of somebody in the terminal, one of those terminal lists, one of those groups in the terminal list, those ancestors separated off from the rest of the human population for some time, and then they continued to be separate as they evolved into a separate subspecies or race. I mean, as I said, Cavalli-Sforza doesn't like the word race, but so a separate group. Now, and also, this is just how the mathematical model he used handled the data. That's one assumption. Second assumption is that none of these groups were produced by the fusion or hybridization of two earlier populations. And every population evolved either by separating off, branching, or by anagenesis, which is just the process by which a group of organisms develop over time, and then they become a separate species because they're subject to selection and so on. But they weren't a separate species at the start, so the species evolves. It becomes a different species from what it was at the start. So there are groups in our evolutionary lineage that are ancestral to us, but they're of different species from us. Right? So that's anagenesis. All right. Now, the geneticist Alan Templeton used statistical techniques that I don't know anything about and I don't understand to show that none of the 9 groups on Cavalli-Sforza's tree, the ones that Andreasen was proposing we should think of as the real biological races, meet condition T1. That is to say, they haven't been reproductively isolated from all the other ones all along. There's always been a bit of gene flow across those populations. Now, that the groups at the end of those branches of the Cavalli-Sforza tree don't meet that condition don't mean they never did. There were never any such groups, but it does mean that there are no such groups now. And so, Cavalli-Sforza's data doesn't support the view that these are groups that meet the treeness condition. And so anyway, so that's a technical objection to the way the modeling was done. And now it could be that the reason that T1 is false of modern populations, human populations, is just that there has been a breakdown in the barriers that did keep the groups reproductively isolated in the past. But as I said, and then it could be true that while human populations currently don't meet the treeness condition, they did in the past. It could also be true that it's, though not true, the treeness objection is roughly true. That is, roughly speaking, there's very low rates of gene flow between the populations of the terminal branches of Cavalli-Sforza's tree. Defenses like this, however, don't meet the final objection, which is that, sorry, those are the possibilities. Don't meet the final objection, which is just the one we discussed as an objection to Mayer's view, which is Andreasen's groups are not genealogical groups. And if you think with Spencer that that's a condition for being biologically real, then they're not biologically real. All right. The final possibility for a biological real classification of human beings that Spencer considers is what he calls, I mean, he's quoting him. He's using the term in the way that the scientists who invented the term use it, an ecotype. That's a group of organisms within a species genetically adapted to a certain environment, right? So, so you might think that, for example, Yoruba people, in southwest Nigeria, are an ecotype because they're genetically adapted to an environment in which there's a lot of malaria. And that's why they have a very high frequency of hemoglobin S in their population. I think one of the highest, perhaps the highest in the world, of any population with that particular hemoglobin variant. And he explores this idea of the ecotype, not by considering that case, which I'll get back to in a minute, but by considering skin color. Skin color, as we've seen, is an evolutionary adaptation to environments with low ultraviolet light, which reduce the rate at which vitamin D3 is produced in the skin. I mean, sorry, if you have dark skin color, that makes it harder to produce vitamin D3 in the skin. But if you have a lot of sun, that doesn't matter because you can produce enough. But if you live in the north of Europe, say, Scandinavia, then you're going to be in a place where sometimes it's dark for months at a time. And then you need to get all the D3 you can get from your skin. So you need lighter skin because the more little light you get is going to that way produce sufficient amounts of D3. All right. Now, Spencer's discussion here, I think, is a little confusing, or at least it initially confused me. He accepts the objection that there is no biological reality to the light-skinned people ecotype because human skin type varies continuously, and drawing a line anywhere is biologically arbitrary. That is to say, on average, people get lighter skin as they go north from the equator or south from the equator. But at least if they've been there, obviously, if their ancestors have been there for a long time, that kind of change doesn't happen quickly. So it's not true that there are, as it were, local groups adapted to the level of sunlight in a particular place that you can distinguish from other groups, because you could draw the lines any way you like bigger or smaller, depending on how much skin color variation you want. So that he objects to. He says that's not the right way. You can't use ecotypical thinking to get to human races, because human races are supposed to be distinguished by their skin color, and skin color varies continuously, it's not discretely across human populations. There are many, actually, a lot of genes involved in skin color, and so you can have different combinations of them and different amounts of melanin, and there are different kinds of melanin and so on. Okay, so he rejects that, but then go back to the sickle cell thing. Then he accepts or discusses the possibility that there is a sickle cell gene-bearing ecotype, which is what I gave as an example earlier. But that's an odd thing to say, because light-skinned color is a property of individuals. Your skin color is a property of you, it's not a property of your population, right? But the skin color properties of the population are just the skin colors of the individuals in the population. Whereas, and nevertheless, it's largely shared in some local populations. Oh, the Yoruba people are all dark-skinned, like except for a few albinos. They have dark skin and curly hair. But sickling is not a trait that's universal in any population. Even in the places in the world, in the Yoruba land, where where it's the highest frequency that I know of hemoglobin S, 73% of the population doesn't carry the gene. Now, 27% is a lot, but it's still around about a quarter. So most Yoruba people do not carry this gene, whereas most Yoruba people, in other words, are black. So that you could say the population is not, the individuals are black, but the population is black. But you can't say the individuals are, the population is sickle cell bearing, except in the sense that there are individual members of the population who are sickle cell hemoglobin S allele bearing. So that would be like referring to a population in which 3/4 of the population had dark skin as a light-skinned population, because 25% of them had light skins. So if you're defining an ecotype in terms of high sickling frequency, which you have to, because that's the only possible way this could be relevant to classifying a population, because as I say, it's not a feature of most of the members of the population, it's a feature of a minority of them, though it just happens to be a very high percentage for a human population. If the property of the population is its frequency of then that's also a property that varies continuously. That is to say, as you move up through Nigeria, it's not when you get to the Niger River, suddenly there's no more sickling, right? And if it's just a matter of the proportion, then the proportion, picking any particular proportion, is just as arbitrary as picking anything else that varies continuously. It's just as arbitrary as picking skin color. So anyway, so I think what he says about there is not quite right. But that doesn't matter, because the key thing to say about ecotypes is that they're really very remote from anything like the sort of race concept of variance. And also, depending on what the adaptation is, people are going to belong to lots of ecotypes, overlapping ecotypes. Because the sickling frequency of a population is responsive to malaria, but the lactase frequency of the population is a matter of whether they live in a place where there are cows, and so they have to be able to process milk as adults. Right? That's a different thing. And the frequency of malaria and the proportion of and the number of cows around are independent variables. There are places where there are lots of cows and no malaria. There are places where there are no cows and lots of malaria. There are places where there are, and so on. They're just two different questions. So there'll be, if your ecotype is a group of people who are adapted because, like the Maasai, they are cattle herders, so they have adult. All infants have a lactase because they have to be able to process the lactose in their mother's milk. But not in many populations, the capacity to do that declines, and by the time you're an adult, you don't do it anymore, and that's why you have to buy Lactaid at the pharmacy if you're lactose intolerant. So I think that nothing, I think, could count as a race concept if the same person could belong to many different races, depending on what you were thinking about at the time. Am I thinking about malaria and hemoglobin? Am I thinking about cows and milk and lactose? Those are all different questions. All right. The last proposal that I'm going to consider is a proposal from Hardiman, which Spencer discusses at the beginning of the second paper. This is what Hardiman calls the minimalist conception of race. According to that, he says, according to ordinary uses of the English word race and its cognates, a race is a group, there are three conditions here. A race is a group of individuals, human beings, distinguished from other groups of human beings by patterns of visible physical features. Remember, that was part 2 of the semantic mismatch objection to Trevally-Schwartz's thing. So those groups are not classifiable by visible features. Their members are linked by a common ancestry peculiar to members of the group, and they originate from a distinctive geographic location. If you've got any groups like that, Hardiman says they're races. Now, I'm not going to go through Spencer's discussion of Hardiman in detail. If you have any questions about it, you can ask them to me or your teaching assistants in section. But there's one key idea of Hardimann's that we need to take on board if we're to have a sense of the current state of play, I think, in debates in systematics about human classification. And that's this. A lot of the recent work on the statistical structure of the human genome, which, as I say, is now hugely different from what it was in Cavalli-Sforza's time, because you can, in those days, you had to go looking for alleles, variant alleles, by looking at proteins and things in people's blood. Now we can just look at the genes directly and we can map them. We can map the whole of an individual human genome, and then we can map representative samples of humans from all over the planet. And so now genomics just has a much, much richer body of data to study the statistical structure of the human genome. How are genes, and not just genes, but sequences, DNA sequences, which are not necessarily genes. There's lots of sequences on our genome that don't code for anything. They don't get decoded by RNA. They're just sitting there, but they can vary and get mutated in the way that genes can. And so we can study those sources of variation, which have no functional significance at all. They're not connected with genes in the sense of things that produce phenotypes. They're just, as it were, junk on the genome. I mean, maybe they have some function, but they don't have the function of producing protein. All right, so we've got a lot of that. And it's exemplified in a paper by Noah Rosenberg et al. That's widely discussed. It's discussed by Spencer, but a lot of people have discussed it. Very major journal, Science. It's published in a major journal. And here's how it goes, the method. You pick a small number, k. By small, I mean 5 or 7 or 12. This is, of course, a natural number, not a real number, a natural number. You pick a small real number, natural number, and you get a computer to try to divide these genomes that you've got all this data for into that number of groups, into set of k groups, using Bayesian statistical methods that we don't need to discuss, such that individuals allocated to the same group resemble each other genetically as much as possible. You try to produce groups that are as like each other as possible. But you have to pick a number. So let's say you try 5, say. And because genetic resemblance is a matter of how many DNA sequences you have in common, there'll be degrees of resemblance. And what the program is doing is trying to find clusters that have as many people as close as possible to each other, right? The program is called structure, or what that. Now, if there's not much statistical structure to the groups, if the genes are sort of randomly, there's variation, but it's random, it doesn't correspond to geography, say, or then the program won't come up with anything. Or it'll come up with different groups of 5 every time you run the program, because it's random. But if there is any interesting structure, the program will find the most probable grouping into k, where k is a number that you picked. So k is not generated from the data. It's not a piece of evidence. It's just a number picked by the researcher. It has no significance. It has no natural significance. Now, however, what does have a natural significance is this. You can run structure for k is 5, and then you can run it for k is 4, and k is 3, and k is 7, and k is 9. And it may be that when you get to k is 5, you get a beautiful set of clusterings. And then at 3, it's messy, and at 7, it's messy. But at 5, you get a beautiful set of clusterings. And that's what the Rosenberg paper does. It takes the data it has, it does run structure, and it gets a beautiful set of clusterings for k is 5. And so now there are a bunch of things to worry about in any particular analysis of this kind. Since this Rosenberg paper, lots of people, which is a while ago, 24 years is a very long time in science. And so people have done similar things with other data sets. But here's some things you want to make sure of. First, you want to make sure that you have a large random sampling of human beings. If it turned out that the reason people were sampled was that the people collecting the sample thought they were black and white and yellow and brown, right? Then what you would be discovering is something about the people who did the selecting. That wouldn't be something about the population, right? So you want to make sure that your selection is random in order to do this, and large and random. Second, you do need to ask how to pick K. And as I say, one reason is that if you pick K, you get an interesting clustering. Now, so to give you another example of this sort of approach, here's an example from a paper later. Few years later, in 2005. This paper used the structure algorithm on the same one that Rosenberg had developed on a set of data of the genomes of a sample of people in the United States and Taiwan. So those were the two geographical areas. And that illustrates this point, because in this case, you got interesting clustering when you set K is 4. Now, however, this study used subjects in the United States and Taiwan who identified themselves as belonging to one of 4 major racial ethnic groups: white, black, African American, East Asian, and Hispanic. And in a way, it doesn't seem terribly surprising that if your sample consists of people who have identified themselves in one of those 4 ways, and you put K as 4 in, you get something back. But it isn't completely uninteresting, because after all, that suggests that what those people are responding to is something that's genuinely there in the statistical structure of the human population. But nevertheless, the reason that K is the right number for this population is that it's the one that produced an interesting structure. And that's fine, because this was not a sampling of the whole human population. So you wouldn't expect it to have to work for the same K as when you're using data from the whole human population. Now, some people cite these papers to argue that the genetic clustering confirmed the subject's own classifications, and to suggest that these biological classifications conform, therefore, to the everyday folk notion of race used in the United States. That's because, as the paper says, of the 3,636 subjects in the sample, only 5, so 0.14%, showed genetic cluster membership different from their self-identified race ethnicity. Now, I'm not really sure that this paper really supports that claim, because this was not a random sample of the US population. They only considered people who identified themselves in one of these groups. Subjects, they say, identified themselves as belonging to one of 4 major racial ethnic groups and were recruited from 15 different geographical areas within the United States and Taiwan. So this was not a random sampling either of the US population, or of the Taiwanese population. And if you look at the whole population, and we can do that because the census collects data about almost everybody. In the 2010 census, for example, nearly 3% of the population identified as mixed race, so much, much more than the 0.014 where there was a mismatch. And remember, they didn't collect anybody who said they were mixed race. And another 1.5% identified, so 10 times the number, the percentage in their sample, identified as Native American, Native Alaskan, Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, which is one of the categories in the census. And while there was a genetic distance between the centers of these 4 clusters that they discovered, there were people at the edge of some clusters who were closer to people at the edge of others than they were to people at the center of their own cluster, right? So there were people like Walter White, whose genetics are probably, well, given the way he looked, we can assume, we can infer that his genetics were probably closer to those of some people who are identified as white in our population than he was to some people who are in the center of the black population, who are very dark-skinned and have, you know, curly hair. The fact that there is statistical clustering of biological properties does not guarantee that a property is biologically significant. There's statistical clustering of hair colors in humans, I'm sure, but a lot of people's hair color is produced by dyes in the modern world. There's still statistical clustering, even with the colors produced by dyes. Nevertheless, there is a reason to think, I think, that the k equals 4 for this sample and the k equals 5 for the Rosenberg sample are biologically significant. Why? Because they confirm the Darwinian account of evolution, right? Because they suggest that adaptation and selection is going on because these groups have moved into different environments. And the reason why is evident in the name that the 5 clusters of the 5 clusters that Rosenberg found are called continental populations, right? Europe, Africa, Asia, America, and Australasia. You'd expect, given our current knowledge of the movement of humanity across the planet over time, that the big barriers to flow are indeed the boundaries of the continents. In the case of Eurasia, Eurasia has a lot of hard-to-cross mountains that separate Europe. The Urals separate Europe from Asia. So even though there isn't a sea separation, as there is between the Americas and Africa and Europe on the Pacific side and the Atlantic side, there's a place you can cross, at least when sometimes on the Pacific side. Even though, so things like the Himalayas, big obstacle to movement, the Ural Mountains, big obstacles to movement, those big obstacles to movement make it reasonable to think that the gene flow among human geographical populations will be low over those boundaries. Now, if you read the Rosenberg paper, it doesn't actually name the 5 groups because he's trying to avoid getting into the race arguments, but they correspond to African, Amerindian, East Asian, European, and Melanesian. Now, Spencer argues that we know roughly why there is this clustering. First humans, here we are, first humans migrated to different geographical regions, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Next, major geographical barriers to human interbreeding, e.g. the Himalayas, Pacific Ocean, prevented random or even frequent interbreeding among people after these new lands were occupied. Finally, genetic diversity arose and spread among people in the same continental regions from mutation and interbreeding after enough time passed. You could have mentioned mutation and selection. So the statistical structure in the human genome produced by this analysis, I think, is biologically interesting and therefore biological in one sense, because it has a biological explanation in terms of the major organizing theory of modern biology, which is the theory of evolution. But something Spencer says in here is not quite right. It is not true that migration was followed by reproductive isolation in all these human populations. There was backward migration, showing you some pictures I was showing you before. There was backward migration, movement in circles, and so on. And that's why, though there is this significant statistical clustering at the k=5 level, lots of people at the edge of clusters or between them. There's another important fact about the Rosenberg paper that Spencer doesn't mention. In the, I don't mean he was hiding it. He mentions lots of things, but it's something that we might want to consider. In the abstract, they say, we studied human population structure using genotypes at 377 autosomal microsatellite loci in 1056 individuals from 52 populations. Within population, differences among individuals account for 93 to 95% of genetic variation. Differences among major groups constitute only 3 to 5%. So, even if there is biological interest, a biological basis for this system of classification, and even if most people fit clearly into one of the 5 groups, which is not really true, but even if they did, there's a question about why we should be interested in this fact outside biology, given that by far the largest source of biological variation between people is within population variance, not across the population variance. Right? 5 goes into 95 how many times? 19. There's 19 times as much variation within these populations as there is across them. So if you're interested, as you might be, in human variation, it's weird to focus on these groups as a source of it, since most of the variation is within populations. Now we can get to the medical doctor question that was asked last time, I think. Yes. All right. Even those like medical doctors, who obviously have an interest in biology, may have reason to wonder whether they need the concept of race. That is defended in papers like, well, Rosenberg, I should be clear, Rosenberg isn't defending a concept of race. He's just talking about interesting statistical structure of the human population. He doesn't care about race. He's not interested in defending race talk. But even those who have an interest in biology may have reason to wonder whether they should be interested in these facts. Medical doctors reasonably like to have data that allows them to take diagnostic shortcuts. So, for example, here's an obvious thing that doctors don't do. They don't look for prostate cancer in women. Women don't have prostates, typically. A few trans women do, but most women don't have prostates. So it'd be a waste of result. It would be weird to say to doctors, oh, you should check for the whole population. It's scandalous that you don't. They don't look for ovarian cancers in men. Right? Also perfectly reasonable. So, shortcuts, I mean, that's such an obvious shortcut that you wouldn't normally think of it as a shortcut, but it is. That's why there are people called gynecologists, right? That's from the Greek word for a woman. So knowing that you could reliably assign people to one of these clusters on the basis of how they looked quickly, that's a shortcut. And then find correlations between that cluster and certain diseases might be helpful, right? That's the thought. So don't throw this, medicine's hard enough without throwing data away. But that depends, of course, on how much of the variation across people in disease susceptibilities is part of the cross-group variation and how much is within groups. And furthermore, knowing that there is such a correlation doesn't tell you that it has a genetic explanation. Much of the difference in health data between African Americans and whites can be explained by the sociological fact that African Americans are typically a lot poorer than whites, and the wealth how much money you have makes a big difference to what healthcare you get, also what you eat, what nutrition you get. And those things are obviously going to affect health. And then there are other environmental factors, like something that's connected with wealth, access to healthcare. Now, here's another thing that differs between African Americans and white Americans. Black Americans are typically exposed to more stress on the basis of racial discrimination than white Americans. And as I've mentioned before, stress has biological effects. It affects hormones, and then those hormones affect, sterols and adrenaline and so on. These are all stress related, and they can affect things like heart disease. So I think that in the United States, it's well worth knowing the race and class of the people you're treating, because there are significant correlations with certain diseases for race and class. But it doesn't follow from the fact that there are such correlations that the explanation is a genetic one. Now, another thing has happened, which is the cultural change has made racing between the continental populations more common across the world. Much more gene flow between the East Asian population and the European and North American populations, much more gene flow between Europe and Africa in both directions, but especially Africans going into Europe. And even though the median American lives within 20 miles of his or her parents, always struck me as a surprising fact, lots of Americans marry someone who belongs to a different racial category on the census. So here are some interesting facts that I found from a website about interracial relationships in America today. Since 1980, the number of individuals of African descent marrying someone of different ethnicity and race has increased from 5%, which is what it was in the 1980 census, to 18%, which is what it was in the 2010 census. This is, I don't know what the 2020 census is. 26% of Hispanic newlywed men have a spouse of a different ethnicity or race, a quarter. The interracial percentage of married couples in the US, that is taking interracial to mean people of different US census categories. The interracial percentage of married couples in the US among individuals, this should interest you guys, with a bachelor's degree or higher is 19%. And in fact, in 2015, 17% of newlyweds were married to an individual of a different ethnicity or race in that particular year of the marriages that occurred. Given these facts, this is the website's on the slide, so you can go and see. That there may be more recent numbers than these. You might think that it's going to be increasingly unlikely that most Americans will fit into one of the existing racial categories in the way that would matter for medicine, even if they were of biological interest. So facts like these are important in evaluating claims about the biological reality of races. I have seen there's a variety of contemporary ways of trying to do this. We have Mayer's geographical races, subspecies. We have Andreassen's cladistic subspecies. We have ecotypes. And we have Rosenberg's continental populations, which are at the heart of Hardiman's minimal conception of race, because they meet Hardiman's conditions, though yeah, the typical member of these groups looks different from the typical member of the other groups. that typical member of a group shares a lot of ancestry with all the others in the group and less with people outside the group. And the reason for that is because the cores of these populations are far apart in the human geographical range, in places which are historically, though no more, somewhat biologically isolated from each other by mountains and oceans. All right, so that's the end of my discussion of these biological approaches. So let's spend a bit of time talking about them. I may start in a minute moving on to where I should have been at the start today, which is the sociological discussions, but I think we should have time to try and sort of make sure that you are okay with all these options and what you think about them. So, what do you think? Yes, sir.
I'm just gonna do a lot of,
Sure, yes.
kind of a response to this, like, I guess it's sort of similar. So even if there are naturally occurring biological groups on the basis of how they cellular genome, and even if those groups seem to resemble places as we talked about, which like could also affect those functions, but for me, like you would still need to prove that those differences are meaningful enough that it's useful in some ways to semantically differentiate them. And to me, race is not an example of that any more than what that and so like we don't have a word to refer to non-redheads, so I know redheads may have certain genetics that makes us see different. Everybody understands it. There's no meaningful difference between redheads and non-redheads that make two fully different. That the most history just coming with this.
No, very well. Very well. Yes, I mean, the fact that you can give an account of a way of classifying doesn't mean that it's something that anybody should care about.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a separate question, as you're saying. Why should we care about it? At least if the account that they offer is a biological account which stresses that the biological differences among humans that are within each population are roughly 20 times as big as the ones across the board. So even from a biological point of view, that's very good call, right, about an individual. So why should we go around classifying people in these ways? Well, clearly we do, right? That is when I say we do, I mean, if you had sat next to the late and justly lamented Jesse Jackson, who died this week, on a plane, first class, and I said to you when you got off the plane, what was the race of the person sitting next to you? Even if you hadn't talked to him, you probably recall that he was black. Whereas if he'd been a redhead, you might not have recalled. Right, so we're programmed to keep track of these things, and he would have been the same with you. You'd say, "Oh, so that's a white guy." I mean, if you've asked, probably would have asked you why you were asking, as much should have people ask these questions. But it's hard to imagine not noticing. If somebody looks like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, right? It's hard to imagine an American not storing away when they look at them the fact that one of them is black and white. Yes. So that's just a fact about where we are as well. Now, there are going to be African Americans like Walter White, of whom that's not true. That is to say, many people, including many black people, only knew he was black because he says so, right? But still, we are keeping track of this. And the fact that we're doing that means that we're behaving in ways that respond to that tracking.
And you think like the fact that everybody like notices things like that more than other physical things is kind of like more like a social, like result of historical things.
Oh, yes.
It's just like, yeah, it still seems just as significant. Like,
Right. No, this is perfectly consistent with any account of where the classification come from, right? I mean, look, the reason we keep track of skin color isn't because we're especially interested in skin color. It's because we're interested in race. I mean because there are lots of easily identifiable figures of pieces of figure you can see, right? We don't keep track of, right? Or like, I mean, there are places where actually they do keep track of red-headed people, and that's because in those places there are ethnic associations. So they're responding to the same sort of reason we respond to our racial categories, namely that they care about the distinction between Irish and Scottish. Right. So the reason we keep track of these visible features isn't that the visible features are terribly interesting or important in themselves, right? It's because they're associated with identity, right? So here's a possibility. And then because of that, it's kind of a self-reinforcing thing. So now people are noticing, and some people are racist, some people are doing things, and so as a result of that, there are correlations, social correlations between these observable phenotypic characteristics and what people are like. That's and those things are there because people are noticing. If they weren't noticing, they wouldn't be there. They couldn't be there because you can't treat people based differently on the basis of race unless you notice their race. Right? And hard as it is to imagine, for us in our society, I'll speak for the United States, maybe others from other parts of the world can tell us what they think about their place. How is this for us to imagine? It is actually possible to live in a world where you don't keep track of those distinctions, because that's how people mostly lived before the 18th century in Europe. That is to say, yes, they noticed if a black person came along, so they occasionally did, but they didn't think of them, they thought of them just as strange. They didn't think that the black ones were stranger than the yellow ones or the Arab ones, right? They just thought they were all different. And so they weren't, the thing they were keeping track of is, are they like us or are they not like us? That was the important thing. And in many categories of ethnic categories, as with say Jews, there's a word for non-members of the category. Jews, Gentiles. Okay. Now, in our racial system, we have some of those: whites, people of color. Right? People of color just means not white. Right? They don't have anything else in common. They're just not white. I mean, anything distinctive else in common. So, if we were thinking like that, if we were just thinking me or something else, that sort of thing, we might remember what color we were, but we wouldn't. We might notice what color we were, but we might not care about it, and that means we might forget it. So, and certainly, you know, in a different world, someone could sit next to someone on an aeroplane of very different skin color and come away from the conversation, and when asked what skin color was, say, you don't remember, right? Even if they had a great conversation, because it wouldn't have any salient, have no more salience, as you said, than whether they had red hair. And you can surely imagine sitting next to someone with red hair in a good conversation and coming away thinking, when asked, I don't know. That wasn't one of the things. It's not that I didn't notice at the time. It's that I didn't store it away because it wasn't interesting. Right? I mean, everybody who's not partially sighted or blind can see the eye color of everybody they talk to. Right? But how many do you know the eye colors of all your friends? And you don't know. So it's not because it's hard to tell. Right? It's trivially easy. If it mattered, you would know. But it doesn't matter. There are other things you don't. there are different ways of the ears, the shapes of ear, thanks to the earlobes, right? You don't know the earlobes, your friends, right? Right? But it's not that you can't, well, I can't see your earlobes, doesn't know a delicious amount of that, but. But for most people, one can see their earlobes, right? And so on. So, you're completely right that it's, if there weren't all this history, right, it would be weird to keep track of this set of technical features rather than any others, right? That's your thought. I think that's completely right. Yes.
I think I agree with that, but I'm a little curious about what you mean about how we're just discussing eye color, hair color, using the shape versus the basis of race using color. Because what you may say, oh, it's easy to tell that people, there is, there are easier things to tell as well. So I feel like if you sort of reconstruct the mental image of somebody, race is a very important factor in reconstruction of the idea of the person. Because it affects many of the categories that you see, facial features, and perhaps part of their body features, as well as the addition of their skin color, which is particularly distinctive because versus eye color, I might not be able to see a person's eyes all the way across the room the same skin color. And I'm pretty sure there was a study by a psychologist or a physicist or something who sort of took a lot of black and white photos, sort of color graded everything fit. And yet a lot of people who took studies on the identification of race and people without skin color were able to.
Oh, yes. So there are other features of people's phenotype apart from skin color. Yes.
So I can imagine.
But again, but the ones we keep track of because they're embedded in this racial story, right? So within, for example, within the African population, there are lots of different types of I don't mean eye colors. I mean, which is all here, and so on. So a lot of the features that people use to classify people racially are actually quite widely distributed in the races that they are associated. And similarly, there's a very wide range of hair types in some racial groups, and in all racial groups there's some variance. So the fact that people typically use a certain configuration of face, of skull, of hair, of skin, to assign them to these groups, is only possible because those are the groups that are socially salient. If we made other groups socially salient, it would be just as easy to identify people by their appearance, but you'd be classifying them into different groups. Correlates with some things, but I correlates with other things.
So would you say it's more socialized factors? Because if you were to, the age group in Africa, there's oftentimes class divide among certain populations of, you could say race, but you could also say like the North versus the South, or the East versus the West, for certain tribes in the, I don't know, different parts of the world. And within those groups, it's very easy to look at someone and say, oh, this person is from this tribe, and this person is from this country. Versus if you live in the Western and travel into China, and I was from northern to southern Chinese person, it might be very hard. But then again, it might be hard for a Chinese person to distinguish different types of people might be considered in a white appearance. They're European, they're American, they're like that. So is it not just simply social?
Right, yes, exactly. It's because of the background social salience of these distinctions that we keep track of the phenomenal, the phenotypic characteristics that we do. So you're right that in Rwanda, right, there are people say there are Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. I mean, then there are and people say, well, this is what Hutu look like, and this is what Tutsi look like, and this is what Twa. Twa are shorter. Hutu are sort of medium, Tutsi are tall, and so on. And Tutsi have longer heads. Hutus have bad heads. Now, and so if you look like a typical Hutu, people will think you're a Hutu. And you look like, but large numbers of Tutsis don't look like typical Tutsis. And large numbers of Hutus don't look like. And I don't know that was what I'm saying. So the fact that there's a visual stereotype of the group doesn't mean that every member of the group conforms to that visual stereotype. That's the point I want to make. And we could use different visual stereotypes, and if we did, we'd get different groups. And it's not just that we could, as you said, we do, right? So you remember what I said about Brazil. In Brazil, people will remember, they sit next down to you, or to you on a plane, they'll remember whether you're Branco or Moreno, which is a distinction that we don't have. And it's on the basis of how people look, right? So now, all of this is responding to features of people that have a strong biological basis. Skin color has a strong biological basis, eye color has a strong genetic basis, earlobes have a strong genetic basis, hair has a strong genetic basis. So people are using properties that are, if you like, biological properties to construct these groups. It doesn't follow from the fact that they're using these properties to classify the groups, but the groups are biological groups. Right? It's just that they're groups classified on, and that doesn't follow that they're groups of the slightest biological significance. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but it doesn't follow from the fact that the property you use. Right. Now, in a particular society, suppose we had a society in which redheads were thought to belong to the devil. Right? And so what you do, if you have a redhead baby, is if you let it live, because maybe you can't actually bring yourself to kill it, you don't treat it very well, and you don't raise it properly. Lo and behold, in such a society, redheads would be less clever than, because they have less education, less interaction with humans. Right? That fact, though they were responding to a biological fact, redheadedness is genetic. Probably one people who also die would have red too. So undyed red hair is significant genetic, but in that society, the explanation for the stupidity of redheads would have nothing to do with either with their general biology. It had to do with the fact that redheads were treated there. Right? This is the point that the Abbe Gregoire made to Thomas Jefferson when he said, "You keep saying that black people can't do these things, but you haven't tried. You haven't allowed them. So who knows what they can do? You don't know. You have no idea." He was saying, you're assuming that it's some inherited trait, some inherent trait, but you can't know that unless you raise black and white people on terms of equality. Then, after a while, if you have real equality then you might be able to tell about the differences in capacity. But without that, you can't. So remember, the fact that you can use a biological property to assign people to a group doesn't mean that the group's a biological group. Redheads are not a biological group in any interesting sense. Redheadedness is not concentrated in any, there's no population that's totally redheaded, and there's redheads are found all over the world. Even in Africa, actually. I mean, among black people. But and furthermore, from the fact that you can associate a biologically determined property of a person with some social fact, it does not follow that the explanation for the association is genetic. That's the point of my story about bashing redheads. The total explanation there has nothing to do with the biological properties of the redheads, except the property that people are responding to, which is having red hair. did you have a question? You can answer it. I'll stay to answer it. You can come and ask me, but these guys are trying to leave. All right, good. So we'll move on to the sociology, a mere 75 minutes late.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
My
Let me-
first also.
Sorry,
Yes, for
This one is stop. Stop recording.